You're listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, I interview Trout Unlimited President and CEO Chris Wood, and we talk about the amazing work that Trout Unlimited is doing, how they are the leading organization fighting to protect the Clean Water Act, Pebble Mine, and also the removal of 4 lower Snake River dams, but also how Trout Unlimited is spreading hope on the climate change front. Hope you enjoy. This episode of The Sustainable Angler is brought to you by Olokai. Olokai is all about handcrafted footwear, finding inspiration in Hawaiian culture and craftsmanship. Fishing is at the heart of Hawaiian culture today, just as it has been for centuries. Generations of fishermen and women expertly cast from rocky shorelines. They spearfish, throw net, and navigate their boats into the deep blue in search of the next catch. No matter how they do it, there's an attention to detail and respect for the ocean that guides their passion. At Olokai, they believe in the same attention to detail when crafting the highest quality shoes and sandals built for every type of marine environment. Olokai's water-friendly Noheamoku slip-on shoe features razor siping for extra grip on the deck, and it's designed for easy on-off barefoot wear. And when it comes to sandals that perform, Olokai's new Ulele provides the comfort and durability of a sneaker. Personally, I love the grip of the Noheamokus, which are perfect for a day out on the water. And I also love that Olokai is a B Corp, meaning they meet the highest social and environmental standards as a company. Whether you're loading up the boat or shoreline fishing from the rocks, Olokai takes you further. Find your local retailer at olokai.com. You know, I'm sure anyone listening to this knows Trout Unlimited. I mean, it's synonymous with fly fishing and conservation, but in some off chance that someone doesn't know what y'all do, I'll let you take that away and run with that.
Yeah, well, so we're a membership organization of about 300,000 members and supporters, all of whom are dedicated to a common mission, which is to protect and restore trout and salmon and the watersheds they depend on. And the way we accomplish that work is through the volunteer efforts of about 400 chapters that are spread all around the country. Each chapter donates an average of about 1,800 hours of community service to the places they live, love, and fish. And then we have a professional staff of about 250 strong who work all over the country, reknitting and repairing and protecting the rivers and streams that people love to fish.
Awesome. And one of the things that I started thinking about and preparing for this interview with y'all, because I mean, I know that y'all do. Trout Unlimited is unique in that it's not just a member organization that's dedicated to conservation. Y'all are also actively working on the policy front, but also doing things that are related to actual boots on the ground, get your hands dirty, volunteer restoration work. So y'all sort of run the gamut. And one of the things that came to mind in preparing for this was, you know, one of the ways that I try and simplify, I guess, environmental threats to fisheries is it's really what I call the 3 Ps, which are policy, population, and pollution. So you're talking about, well, how does population affect our fisheries? Well, things like overfishing, right? Worldwide population is growing. We might overfish some areas and deplete fish stocks. So how does policy affect our fisheries, and that can be done in a number of ways. But things such as climate change policy, or Magnuson-Stevens, or the clean water rule. So a number of ways that the policy can impact our fisheries, and then pollution, which is an obvious thing, is plastic pollution that negatively affects our fisheries. But I think one of the greatest threat to our fisheries is climate change, especially with cold water species, and that's pollution in the form of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I thought I would maybe format this a little bit on this call, and maybe we dissect each of those threats and what Trout Unlimited is doing to address them. So why don't we start with how is population, I guess, would you say, affecting cold water species?
Well, I mean, you hit on it earlier. One of the challenges we have is that as some of these smaller, isolated populations of fish become discovered and advertised on social media, for example, some of them are susceptible to being fished out. We're in this really interesting place as a nation. Historically, there were 28 different native species of trout in America. We've lost three. Three have become extinct over time. And of those that remain, more than half occupy less than 25% of their historic habitat. And so when you think about like Rio Grande cutthroat trout, or Apache trout, or Gila trout, these populations are no longer occupying the smaller tributaries upstream, and then the mid-elevation streams, and then the larger rivers downstream. Generally, they're often isolated in these higher elevation areas, often, not always, but often on public lands. And they're very susceptible to potentially being fished out. So, one of the things that we do is work to create what biologists call meta-populations. And that's where you're taking these relic, isolated trout populations that are found in high elevation streams and doing the work to reconnect those streams, down to lower elevation areas by everything from, fixing perch culverts and replacing them with bridges, to getting rid of unneeded or obsolete dams, to changing Western water law, for example, to make it more amenable to conservation, to leaving water in stream for fish, and then doing restoration in the valley bottoms where the larger rivers are. And if you can allow fish to access these different parts of the watershed and exhibit their various life history forms, where they're in the small tributaries at one point in the season, and they move down to the larger water bodies to feed and get big, and then move back up to the tributaries to spawn, you're much more likely to be able to maintain healthy populations of trout and salmon. And it also is a guard against climate change, which is another issue that you mentioned. That notion of protecting the highest quality habitats, reconnecting river systems, and allowing fish to move through reconnected systems and access lower elevation areas because you've done restoration on them, that happens to be the most effective climate change adaptation strategy that's out there. And what I mean by climate change adaptation is simply helping these rivers and streams to recover their natural resiliency, so they're better able to withstand the effects of flood and fire and drought.
That's and so that is part of Trout Unlimited strategy. And I don't know if it's necessarily strategy, but part of what y'all do in terms of a lot of the actual boots on the ground type restoration work. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of people maybe don't connect the dots between. Okay, well, what are some natural climate solutions, and a lot of that is restoration type work, right? Because you're going, well, look, if we can plant more trees along the banks of a river, they'll not only absorb CO2, but they'll also provide shade for fish that are making that migration from other bodies of water back and up into tributaries along the way. Is that sort of kind of the idea with some of that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's just basically putting back together healthy, intact watersheds, and I mean the entire watershed. We've gone, as an organization, we've gone through this evolution where in the 70s and the 80s, we were working on individual stream reaches, right? Like local chapters working on a local stream. And then in the 90s, it was sort of the advent of that whole concept of the watershed approach. And we began working at scale on larger water bodies, fixing the problems that began up in the headwaters and then working our way downstream. Now we're actually working at regional landscapes. And it's the boots on the ground component that you mentioned that's just absolutely vital here. There are places like the driftless area it's the unglaciated region of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. And what happened is when the last glaciers receded, they just bypassed this area. So it's not typical of Midwest landscapes. It's got more hills, and it's almost reminiscent of Vermont. And that there was 150 years of intensive agriculture there that had really destroyed a lot of those rivers and streams. And so we've now begun working in that landscape. It's a huge landscape, and we're doing about 100 miles of stream restoration a year, where we these deeply incised channels, that have been down cut by flooding, we'll go ahead and peel those stream channels back, put the natural sinuosity of the river back in place, by using heavy equipment, so they get the bends and the meanders back in the river, and then revegetate with native shortgrass prairie. And the trout response is downright phenomenal. We now do about 100 miles. We've done over 100 miles, probably 125 miles. We do about 20 a year now of stream restoration in the driftless area. And the trout response is phenomenal. We see pre-restoration like 100 to 200 trout per mile. And
wow.
a year after restoration, that number grows tenfold. It goes from 100 to 1,000, from 200 to 2,000 fish per mile. And if you can do that kind of restoration at scale, which is what we're doing in the driftless area and other parts of the country, then you can actually get ahead of the effects of a changing climate. And that's the work that we need to do all around the country.
That's amazing. And I mean, and those numbers are just, that's incredible. I mean, from 200 to 2,000, I mean, that's it sounds like it's too good to be true almost. That's awesome.
No, it's true. And if you look at the work of the organization at scale, I'm just talking about the professional staff contribution. This is not including the chapter contributions, which I don't have at my fingertips right now. But last year alone, we protected over 1,100 river miles. We reconnected over 420 miles, and we restored about 510 miles around the nation. And, I want to double those numbers in a relatively short period of time because we have to, because these fish, they are literally the canary in the coal mine. Yep. And as they go, so do we. And if we can, my hope is that by demonstrating that you can protect cold water fisheries, we'll give people hope that climate change isn't one of these issues like taxes, where you're like, taxes, what are you going to do about it? I hate taxes. Well, climate change has the potential to make to almost deaden people's nerves and to feel that it's so big, it's so existential, it's inevitable. There's nothing I can do about it. And that's simply not true. We can take concrete steps today to make these systems more resilient for trout tomorrow. And we can also engage in advocacy to ensure that we're not just dealing with the effects of a changing climate, we're actually dealing with the causes of climate change. And that's one of the reasons that TU has been in support of various pieces of climate legislation that would limit or otherwise regulate the release of carbon, which I know is very controversial. And but it's not. Our mission doesn't allow us to sit on the sideline and pretend that the effects of climate change aren't any of our business.
Yeah, and I I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, here's kind of tying a little bit of population to policy and what we're talking about. It's like, look, 1,000 years ago, you could do a lot of things without having a detrimental effect to the environment. And where we are now is that we're at about 8 billion people on the planet, and it's going to be 9 billion by 2050. Well, if you're not taking into account things like, well, if greenhouse gases caused from burning fossil fuels are accelerating climate change to an unnatural pace, and it's affecting everything from our oceans to cold water species like trout to causing droughts, wildfires, all sorts of things. Well, you've got to change your strategy, and part of that is implementing and executing effective policy to address the issue, because it's a systemic problem. It's not just, hey, I'm an individual and I can do X, Y, Z, and hey, I'm a business and we can do X, Y, Z to address this. It also requires the systemic type change at a policy level. So I'm in full support of regulating carbon, and I commend you all for supporting that, because it's where we are on the life of the planet. It just is what it is. Which might be sort of a good segue to start talking about some policy issues. And so I'll kind of leave that open-ended to you if you want to talk climate. But I know another big thing that we're talking about is the clean water rule too.
Yeah. It's interesting. TU there's a lot of different organizations out there that do policy work, right? You're probably familiar with many of them. There's the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, NRDC, the list goes on. And there's a lot of groups that do on-the-ground habitat restoration. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, etc. There are very few, if any, groups that marry on-the-ground habitat restoration with policy work. And that's basically the space the TU lives in. And what we try to do is leverage the goodwill that we create in literally thousands of communities around the country by literally making fishing better, by making rivers and streams cleaner. We try to leverage that into advocacy for important policy issues. And there is no more important policy issue for anglers than the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act, of course, was passed in 1972. Huge bipartisan support. This is an era when rivers were burning. Rivers were burning. Think about that for a second.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. And that's the river that was most famous for burning was the Cuyahoga River, which now has, something like 75 species in it. And thanks to the Clean Water Act, it's got a great walleye fishery. It's got a great smallmouth fishery. And the government what they do is they create rules to implement laws that Congress passes. And the Trump administration just passed some new rules called the Clean Water Rules. And these rules, and I'm not kidding here, according to our scientists, these rules would eliminate the protections of the Clean Water Act for about half of all of the stream miles in the United States. Now, just to give you a sense of what that means, what they're doing is they're proposing eliminating the Clean Water Act for what they call ephemeral streams. So these are seasonal streams that typically flow in reaction or in response to like rainfall, right?
Okay.
Or runoff. And they're absolutely vital. I mean, these are the capillaries they're the arteries of our rivers and streams. And historically, for the first 30 years of the Clean Water Act, if, say, for example, a farmer wanted to put a lagoon pond in an ephemeral stream, he would have to get a permit under the Clean Water Act to do so. It's kind of a look before you leap concept, because they would want to make sure that we've taken precautions, for example, to make sure that lagoon pond doesn't end up, which is animal waste, doesn't end up running into a perennial stream that we all fish in, that we swim in, that our drinking water comes from. And now, under these new rules, that farmer could build that lagoon pond in that ephemeral stream. And if it blew out and ran into a perennial stream downstream, that wouldn't be his fault. He would not have had to get a permit under the Clean Water Act any longer to make sure that downstream water resources aren't affected. And the same goes for pipeline crossings. Same goes for storing gas tanks. The same goes for road crossings. All of those activities, which have potential downstream effects, no longer need to have a permit under the Clean Water Act. And we think this is a really big mistake. And that's one of the issues that we're working on right now, is how we're going to respond to these rules. And everything's on the table, whether we decide to litigate or we try to go back to Congress to pass a law to strengthen the clean water rules or the Clean Water Act itself, to make clear that the small streams that feed into big streams are also protected. It's an issue that anglers really need to care about. It's a really big deal.
Yeah, and it. I don't know if you know the answer to this. I guess no one does, but it seems common sense tells you, without even looking at the science. But we'll get to the science. But common sense tells you that water is our most valuable resource, and to do anything that would potentially make it more difficult, not only for fish species, for example, to survive, but for our own consumption, it defies logic, honestly. But then you add into the fact that you have scientists who it's science. Science is truth, and the scientists are telling you that this is a bad idea. Where is the
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, facts are facts.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Facts are facts. And a fact is that gravity works cheap and it never takes a day off. And eventually everything that we do, in the headwaters of these rivers and streams is going to be it's going to show up downstream. And, the fact that we wouldn't recognize that is just it's frankly frightening, and I think every anglers all over the country ought to be outraged by this.
Yeah.
And thankfully we're seeing that support, but we've got to make our voices heard. I mean, some of these policymakers are pretty cynical people, and their hope is that hunters and anglers, they don't want to get involved in policy. They're not going to bother to, realize that half of the nation's wetlands will no longer be protected by the Clean Water Act. That, in places like Arizona, 83% of their streams would lose protection under the Clean Water Act. They're hoping that in places like West Virginia and Virginia, that people won't realize that, more than 80 small streams would be affected by one pipeline, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that's under proposal right now. And they're hoping that that hunters and anglers won't make their voice heard. And our job, our collective job as anglers, is to make sure that doesn't happen. That, we are, these people work for us. We elect them. We put them into office. And it's imperative, it's incumbent on us to make our voices heard, to let them know it's not acceptable to eviscerate the Clean Water Act. That's too important for the $887 billion outdoor recreation economy that we depend on in this country.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's mind blowing to me that this stuff is even that rolling back the clean water rules of the Clean Water Act is even on the table, but it is, which is crazy. So then think about, well, how is it that a few hundred of our elected officials are making these decisions, and there's hundreds of millions of us who oppose it? It's totally insane to me. But it's also okay. Well, let's talk about it. Okay. Well, they want to put in pipelines, right? Because they want more fossil fuels. Well, that's also contributing to climate change. And I'm not saying we have the solutions, but we need the policy. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? You have to have the policy to make changes, to make headway on climate change. If you start making headway on climate change, then you don't need pipelines to transport oil and gas. And then you're just putting yourself in a better position to protect streams to begin with. So it's all interconnected.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good point. I mean, it speaks to another issue on the policy front that I'd be remiss not to mention. All forms of energy development have impacts. We know that, right? We all know that. And but it seems like renewable energy, for the health of the planet, is going to play a more prominent role in the future than it has in the past. And we've been advocating with other groups for something called the Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act. And the idea behind that act is to treat renewable energy, which is really not, it's kind of an afterthought on our public lands right now that are managed by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Our hope is to accelerate the expansion of renewable energy on public lands in places where it belongs, not in places that are sensitive to fish and wildlife, but in places where they've already done environmental analysis and identified logical landscapes to put wind and solar. And importantly, it would take renewable energy, and which is treated like what's called it's treated right now under a special use permit. So it's the same permit you'd go to the Forest Service to get if you wanted to cut a Christmas tree down in December. That's the same permit they use presently to do siting of renewable energy development. We want to treat renewables just like a leasable mineral. And that, what I mean by that is like coal or oil or gas. And so when it's produced, there would be a revenue stream that's generated, and we want to plow a significant percent of that revenue back into habitat restoration for fish and wildlife. And our hope is that we can both accelerate the expansion of renewable energy development, which is better for the planet, and at the same time create a fund to allow us to deal with the aftermath of that kind of development and other development, so we don't get into a situation like we have right now on many of our public lands where, back in the 1800s, Congress used the notion of expanding the West by giving people free land to develop minerals, and they created this. We inadvertently created a tremendous number of abandoned mines that sit on the landscape today, like ticking time bombs. We're trying to avoid that problem with this Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act.
This episode of The Sustainable Angler is also brought to you by Emerger Strategies, a sustainable business consultancy whose mission is to solve the climate crisis by improving the social, environmental, and economic bottom lines of your business. Measure what matters with Emerger Strategies. To learn more about how Emerger Strategies can help your business go carbon neutral or zero waste, visit emergerstrategies.com. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund is basically a conservation fund that really if I understand it correctly, is basically a tax that oil and gas companies are paying to give back to a conservation fund to
Yep.
to basically, it's a tax on that. This sounds like the Land and Water Conservation Fund of the 21st century. The way it should be is saying, hey, look, we've got public lands. We should be developing renewable energy that helps fight climate change, and then using that revenue to then further enhance restoration and protect our waterways, which is
exactly right.
It's that's awesome. I love that. I mean, what's not to like about that? That's incredible.
Yeah. Well, that's one of a major policy initiative that TU's working on. I'm kind of proud of that initiative. We've been working on it for about 10 years. As you can imagine, it takes a long time nowadays to pass legislation, and that's okay because we shouldn't be passing legislation willy-nilly. We should be conservative in the laws that we're passing. But this one makes a ton of sense, and that's why it's totally bipartisan. We've got support from Republicans, from Democrats, from incredibly liberal people to incredibly conservative people, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get that done here in the near future.
That's awesome. Well, I support it. That's for sure. So
good. Glad to hear that.
All right, so we've we've covered a little bit of ground talking about population and policy, and I think we've clearly demonstrated how that's interconnected, and we've touched the surface on. Well, I wouldn't say maybe we've done more than touch the surface on climate change, but let's sort of dive in a little bit more on the pollution side. If there's anything that we haven't covered already. As it relates to, and what's funny about this is you realize just how interconnected all of this is, right? Because you're going, well, all right, well, if we're talking about pollution, and it's not just, you can say things like plastic, but we're also talking about what you're talking about. If there's a farmer who builds a retention pond and it's filled with pig waste, for example, and that through heavy rains or whatever leaks into the stream, that's another form of pollution. And so there's pollution is broad, but is there anything that we haven't covered that maybe you care to elaborate on how pollution is impacting our fisheries and what Trout Unlimited is, aside from everything that you're already doing, that we've talked about, what maybe how Trout Unlimited is addressing some of those pollution issues, like whether it be climate change, clean water. I'll just let you go from there, but.
Yeah, it's, again, like I said earlier, trout or canaries in the coal mine, everything we do on the land is ultimately reflected in the health of our rivers. So whether it's making a priority of cleaning up abandoned mines in the West that are legacy mines that have been out there for 100 years, or working with communities in Appalachia to clean up the effects of abandoned mines and abandoned mine drainage from coal mines, or working collaboratively with farmers to implement best practices and protect and recover private streams in agricultural areas through the Farm Bill. We do it all. I mean, literally, there is almost no form of pollution that affects water quality, that affects trout and salmon, that TU isn't working around the country to try to repair. So, I can go on at length about any form of pollution and how TU is trying to repair it. But as an angler, what I would say is rest assured that, we're out there trying to make fishing better. I mean, that's basically what we do as an organization. And our reason for that is simple. If we, we're losing anglers, right? Fly fishing's doing well, but other forms of fishing are shrinking, and hunting is in decline across the country. And in the span of a single generation, we've gone from 60% of us growing up in rural environments to more than 80% of us living in cities and suburbs. And if we're not training that next generation of conservation stewards to care about habitat restoration, to care about habitat protection, to care about getting out on the water and fishing. They're not going to care. They won't be there. And when future policymakers try to further restrict the Clean Water Act or try to propose boneheaded proposals like building a mine in Bristol Bay, the world's most prolific and important salmon fishery, then those activities will happen. If we're not there to fight against bad ideas and to protect good ideas, bad things are going to happen for fisheries. And that's basically my pitch for why anybody who loves to fish should join Trout Unlimited.
Absolutely. And actually, this is probably a perfect segue, because I know that, y'all have tons of local chapters. You've got obviously what y'all do at the national level. This is probably a perfect opportunity to talk about some of those. What are some success stories that come to mind that Trout Unlimited has produced recently? Because everything that you're saying is exactly right. If we don't have a generation out there getting outdoors, which it's basically everything that I've read, it's kind of all in decline. People aren't getting outdoors as much. They're not fishing or hunting as much. Fly fishing kind of being an exception to that. I think a lot of the younger generation or millennials, and they're getting into fly fishing, which is awesome. The more fly anglers we have, or the more anglers we have in general, the more conservationists we have, and the more conservationists we have, then you are happy to support organizations like Trout Unlimited who are fighting for you at a policy level. And I think that's something that everyone listening to this should understand is, when you're going to renew your Trout Unlimited membership, that's what you're a part of that. You're a part of that solution. So what are some of those other success stories that you can share that Trout Unlimited has accomplished?
I could go on and on. I'll just give you a couple of highlights. There were programs that were the president every year is required to submit a budget to Congress, and he had proposed cutting federal funding for the Chesapeake, the Great Lakes, the Delaware, and the Pacific Coast salmon states. Thanks to the engagement of TU and our staff, and especially our volunteers, we beat each of those proposals back. And so one quick vignette, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was historically funded at $300 million a year. And that's the kind of work that allows us to reconnect Great Lake tributaries back to the lakes so we can get these fish populations that are able to, demonstrate their full life history like we talked about earlier. And the president's budget proposed zeroing that out. And we engaged members from all over the Great Lakes states. They came back and visited with their members of Congress. And I'm happy to report that the program not only didn't get zeroed out, but it's been proposed at funding now for $320 million. So we actually increased the funding. And then, more on the ground stuff, in places like the East Fork of the Wind River in Wyoming, we removed 2 different dams last year, opening up about 20 miles of habitat. We're in the verge right now of taking out a dam in Montana, right outside of Missoula, called the Rattlesnake Dam. And when we do that, that's going to reconnect, an urban river up to the Rattlesnake Wilderness in the headwaters, so that fish can, swim through these connected systems. We were successful in Washington State in the Upper Methow Valley, which is really important for salmon and steelhead. We helped to convince Congress to withdraw about 350,000 acres of that area from what would have been a proposed copper mine. The list goes on and on. We succeeded in getting one of the first federally protected wild steelhead management areas, 100,000 acres, on a place called on the North Umpqua, named in honor of Frank and Jeannie Moore. Frank Moore is a wonderful man that incredible legend out in that neck of the woods, World War II veteran who has spent a lifetime trying to protect that river system, and now it's protected. But the list goes on and on. We work with over 400 farmers and landowners in West Virginia to help recover over 100 miles of the East Fork of the Greenbrier. I mentioned the driftless area. We've got scientists around the country who are working to help the Fish and Wildlife Service look at the Endangered Species Act as more than just keeping species from becoming extinct, but instead to pivot and look at it as a way to actually recover fish as opposed to just keeping them from becoming extinct. We've got chapters all around the country who are, working with kids over, I think it was something like 1,700. We had 1,700 discrete programs focused on kids. We had over 700 events last year that were focused on helping veterans to, find solace and healing through the power of fly fishing and the healing power of being on a river. I mean, the list goes. I keep on about the accomplishments of the organization. I mean, but they are many.
Yeah,
and that's one of the things. It's one of the things I don't think people understand. I don't think people have any idea how much work we do. I really don't. I think most people that think about Trout Unlimited, they're like, oh yeah, they're a bunch of old white guys, right? They get together once a month and show slideshows.
Right.
But what they don't know is that we're the leading organization fighting to protect the clean water rule. They don't know that we're the leading organization fighting to stop the Pebble Mine. They don't know that we're the leading organization that will eventually remove the 4 lower Snake River dams so that we can have healthy, robust, and catchable populations of fish in Idaho again.
That's unbelievable. I mean, just that was just you rattling off, and that's probably just scratching the surface. And that's also not even for, I would imagine, all of the smaller restoration type projects that some local chapters are working on that aren't as big of a headline as Pebble Mine or the Clean Water Act.
That's exactly right.
And one of the reasons I know that actually is one of my clients, Rep Your Water, who I know is a big supporter of Trout Unlimited and local sponsors. They do a lot with their local chapter, and they were the ones who kind of educated me on that. And they were like, oh yeah, no, we have a stream near our office that we work with our local chapter on and do cleanups and all sorts of great activities that get the community involved, that are, to your point, talking about, well, how do we get this next generation to care? Well, bring them to a cleanup, a Trout Unlimited cleanup, or bring them, find a local chapter and bring your neighbor, bring your kids, whatever. Take them out there, yeah. Let them get their hands dirty and understand that it's not just about, you can have fun doing this. It's not just about, like, hey, this is really serious, we need to clean all this up. It's also, hey, this is just part of instilling values that will last them the rest of their life of hey, this is something that's bigger than me, and I want to make sure that I do my part to protect it.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think about the work of some of these chapters. I mean, the Chattahoochee chapter, Upper Chattahoochee River chapter in Georgia, they founded this thing called #CleanMyWater. And they created this viral campaign for people to go out and fill their net or fill a trash bag or fill their drift boat with trash, and then take pictures of it and post it on social media. And it's become like a competition where people are out there trying to find the most trash. Now, okay, is that gonna protect trout and salmon from the effects of a changing climate or from the evisceration of the Clean Water Act? Of course not. But is it going to create goodwill in a local community? And is it going to build a future? Is it going to build an army of conservation stewards? You bet it will. And will those people who are out there filling trash bags or nets with trash and then posting that on social media be then willing to be more likely to take action when we ask them to help protect a place like Bristol Bay? Yeah, you're darn right it will. And so that's what our chapters do, is they're building advocates. They're creating an army of conservation stewards that will help to protect these lands and waters that, that mean so much to us as anglers.
No, I love it. Chris, where, if just in case no one doesn't know where to go to become a member, I know there's a couple of ways to support. I know that you, I believe, can be a business member. You can be an individual member. Where can people get more information and get involved with Trout Unlimited?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the easy way is to go to www.tu.org. That's our website. But you're right. There's all kinds of ways to get involved. If you want to become a basic member, just go to the website. We make it really easy to do. If you're a business out there and you're not already, become one of our TUBs, TU business members. We've got about 500 of them all around the country right now, and they are the tip of the spear for us in terms of going out and engaging anglers in conservation and engaging people as advocates, engaging people to become members of TU. If you've got more capacity and you want to support TU at a bigger level, you can join something that we call our Griffith Circle, which is named after George Griffith, one of the founders of TU. So there's all kinds of ways to help support the organization. One of the biggest things that we're emphasizing these days is actually something they call planned giving. And it's one thing to write a check today and help the organization immediately. But I have a friend who has said that planned giving, which means literally including Trout Unlimited in your estate plan, it's the least painful gift that you'll ever give because you never actually write the check. It happens upon your demise. But anyway, there are, we make it real, as you can imagine, we make it really easy to give. And so the easiest way to do that is just to go to tu.org, become a member, look on the website for where your local chapter is, get involved locally, get involved nationally, help us with some of these big national campaigns. We can only do more and more the more we build this army of conservation stewards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is probably a great message to wrap with, Chris, is, hey, if you want to get involved and be part of, I don't know if y'all would term it this, but I'll term it this, the Trout Unlimited Conservation Army. Okay. It's official now. It's the Trout Unlimited Conservation Army.
I love it.
If you want to be part of that, which I would encourage you to do, I'm a supporter, and especially now with a young daughter who's 16 months old and is going to be inheriting this land and water from us. It's increasingly important to support these organizations that are doing the work. So I personally would like to thank you and thank Trout Unlimited for all that y'all are doing to protect what we all love. And like I said, I would encourage anyone to who's looking to make an impact or figure out a way to get involved in their local community, to head over to www.tu.org and get involved. So I really appreciate your time, Chris, and thank you for doing the interview.
It's been my pleasure, Rick. I appreciate the chance to visit with you today.
Thanks for listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. Also, special thanks to Chris Wood from Trout Unlimited. If you'd like to check out our show notes, visit our blog at emergerstrategies.com. Also, if you could, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. That really helps us out a lot. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.